how it should be. Your application shouldn't depend on a single, data center point of failure. We were looking at what Rackspace is doing. Has anyone seen that ice truck that Rackable's making? It's basically a data center in a semi-rig. So you drive it around wherever the power is cheapest and the network's cheapest, right? Same kind of concept. Ultimately, we're going to move wherever the hosting is cheapest and where the support of the technology is cheapest. So as this pendulum has been swinging back and forth, think about what we had in terms of security in the mainframe days. Was there such thing as a buffer overflow? What were our security concerns in the mainframe days? We didn't really have any, right? And when you think about doing a mainframe assessment, what you're worried about is all your middleware, because that's where we started doing things wrong. So the reason why you can't just come in and say, this is everything that we're already doing, so just secure it the way that you've always done it, is because history repeats itself, right? We want to make sure that we're not making the same mistakes when we build this architecture right this time. So looking at some of the things that we've kind of accumulated, these barnacles that have attached themselves to our pendulum, what's gone wrong since we moved away from mainframe and tried to go to general purpose computing? So one main problem is that we got away from the boundary separation between data and functionality, right? So on the mainframe, data didn't execute. And that's the fundamental problem behind almost every single application security vulnerability that you could even talk about as being high risk, right? Original buffer overflow, it's data being interpreted as functional code. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection. All of those are fundamentally, problems that resulted from blurring the boundary between data and functionality. So when we're building our software as a service architecture, obviously something that we've got to keep in mind. But that's just one example of the things that started going wrong when we decided that, hey, we can do all this cool stuff on the client side. So all those things are going to be things that we had to think about when we move back to the true sort of mainframe environment. If we're gonna go back that direction, let's make sure we remember what was good about it. So I think everybody at this point has at least heard the idea of the death as a perimeter. I don't know if any of us have fully let go of that, since most of us in this room have been doing this for a long time, and that's how we were raised, right? We were raised on the perimeter. Build your firewall defense. Build up, us versus them mentality. Build up this idea of there is an inside and an outside, and it has to go away. There's no way that you can accommodate that, even in today's environment, let alone when we move to the SaaS kind of platform. So some of the interesting things about SaaS, in terms of ramming home the idea that the perimeter is dead. You think about how SaaS is acquired. So think about how people go out and buy a subscription to Salesforce.com, for instance. Is it IT that's recognizing this business need? No, IT has always been sort of like a gate because they're in line with the purchasing process. You got to buy a piece of software, you got to buy it through IT. But one of the interesting things that Salesforce has seen happen is that HR departments or business units will go out and find these SaaS platforms and say, hey, this will fit our business need. We don't need to go through IT because it's a subscription service. We don't need to install it on our machines. We don't have any of the traditional controls there. So companies are finding themselves owning subscriptions to these services, and data are being put out on the web, right? So suddenly IT security comes to this problem and says, what happened to our perimeter? Why are data being pushed through our firewall on port 80 outside of our printer? We have no control over it. It's a great example of how SaaS just totally breaks down that whole model. You think about how you build a perimeter about a SaaS application itself. How do you even create a threat model for that? Where do you draw the trust boundaries on a SaaS application? Do you draw it around the whole thing? Do you draw it around just the client and try to focus on that? Do you draw it around the grid? How do you draw a trust boundary around grid computing? It's again, we had to totally change the way that we're thinking about security already, and then SaaS is just kind of the final nail in that coffin in terms of how do we think about security from an us versus them, inside outside perimeter based perspective. So I talked a little bit before about some of the, another benefit of the idea of making a box product into a SaaS product. So this whole idea of copyright protection and anti-piracy and all of that, I find it hilarious, and it's fundamentally impossible to protect client-side code running on a general-purpose computer. And the fact that there's whole industries sprung up around the idea of, protecting, data on the client side, without quantum encryption, obviously, it's crazy. It's trying to stuff the genie back in the bottle. And the cool thing about SaaS is it totally steps around that whole problem. I mean, yeah, there's going to be some blurring where, okay, what happens if you are putting Photoshop on the web, but all you're doing is just creating a JavaScript version of Photoshop? Well, yeah, somebody could just pull down your JavaScript code and then, repurpose it to run it on their own machine. But the reality is that a lot of the code is actually going to be pushed back into the cloud, so that in order to pirate the service, you'd have to get access to the source or find some way to get into the cloud and get the functional, functional code that way. So this idea of wholesale drop ship of pirated software, it won't exist anymore, right? Because you're not buying the software, you're buying a service which includes, data storage and all these additional features. So you're, to some extent, you're decoupling the separation between functionality and data. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do that without maintaining the separation that we talked about before. So another really interesting aspect of SaaS, I think it's one of the reasons that I think Autodesk has moved to that model as well, because AutoCAD is also one of the most pirated applications out there, simply because it is so expensive. So the idea of data security, again, we talked about how the perimeter is dead, but the idea of data security absolutely isn't dead. Otherwise none of us would have jobs anymore. There may be a trend toward more openness. Maybe the whole industry around selling data crashes because everybody has it at some point. Maybe the value of data gets driven down to a point where this doesn't matter. I severely doubt it. That's one thing that people are going to be holding on to pretty tightly, and I don't think it's going to go away. So how do you maintain confidentiality of data in a SaaS model? So again, when you think about how the perimeter is dead and how you can't define a trust boundary around grid computing, this becomes a really challenging question. So when you think about, well, how do you secure data? Think about your Gmail account, for instance. Your email isn't encrypted on Google's servers. They're using their technology to search it and sell you new and better stuff based on your unencrypted email, right? But what if you don't want it to be that way? What if you want to use a software as a service product, but you don't want them looking at your data? How do you solve that problem? It's a really challenging question. A couple ways to approach it. I mean, you could manage your key escrow on the client side, right? So encrypt your data before you upload it. You have a lot of disadvantages there in that the software can't operate on your data on the server side, other than doing replication and various sort of data maintenance tasks. But if you're trying to do rapid sort, rapid search, you can't do that without unencrypted data, right? So fundamentally, you're kind of breaking the model of software as a service if you want to escrow your keys on the client side. And most customers, they come to a SaaS platform because they don't want to do any of that. So forcing them to do key escrow, suddenly you're giving some responsibility for the data maintenance to your client. Where is the